Good morning. Welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
At 78 years old, Evelyn Carter was completely erased. In a single afternoon, her world didn't end with a scream or a fight, but with a terrifying, polite silence. As her grandson Daniel looked away in shame, the life she had built for decades was reduced to what she could carry in 3 small bags. She wasn't just homeless, she was inconvenient. With the cold wind of rejection at her back, Evelyn did something that made the entire town of Brackenridge Hollow think she'd finally lost her mind. She took her last $10, the final thread of her survival, and bought a nightmare. She purchased a condemned, rotting mill house that the local authorities were desperate to tear down. The clerk at the municipal office laughed under his breath as he took her crumpled bill. Neighbors whispered that she was choosing a grave instead of a home. They saw a broken woman moving into a broken ruin, but what they didn't know was that Evelyn wasn't just looking for a roof, she was listening to the house. And buried deep beneath the warped floorboards and the rusted gears of the old mill wheel lay a secret hidden since before she was born. A secret so powerful, it didn't just contain the truth about a dead man named Thomas Whitlock, it contained the key to reclaiming her dignity and bringing an entire corrupt system to its knees. This is the story of how a $10 ruin changed Evelyn's life forever, proving that sometimes the things the world discards are the only things worth saving. Before we uncover what Evelyn found beneath the floorboards, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of incredible discovery. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? We love meeting our global community. Now, let's go back to the moment Evelyn stepped across the threshold of the house no one wanted. The walk away from her grandson's house felt longer than all her 78 years combined. Every step Evelyn took was a heavy reminder of her new reality, invisibility. As she moved down the sidewalk, her fingers cramped around the handles of her 3 bags, the cloth scented with lavender, the heavy frames of old photos, and the rustle of paper memories. She saw the curtains in the neighboring houses twitch. She knew those eyes. They weren't looking with pity. They were looking with relief that it wasn't them. The world wasn't attacking her. It was simply withdrawing, like a tide leaving a piece of driftwood stranded on the sand. Evelyn didn't cry. At her age, shock doesn't arrive as a storm. It arrives as a profound, chilling stillness. She found herself whispering, "I'm sorry," to strangers who bumped into her, and apologizing for the crime of occupying space. A stroke of luck, or perhaps destiny, arrived in the form of a rusted pickup truck. The driver, a man with a face like a crumpled map, offered her a ride. As they drove toward Brackenridge Hollow, the landscape began to mirror Evelyn's soul. Brackenridge wasn't just a town, it was a ghost of the industrial age. Once a thriving hub powered by the rush of the river, it had decayed slowly over decades. As the truck passed the skeletal remains of the old mill, the driver gestured vaguely toward the valley. "People stay clear of that part of the river, ma'am," he muttered. The water went sour, and the history went sour with it. He dropped her near a sagging general store. There, under the flickering hum of a dying neon sign, Evelyn sat on a wooden bench. Like the evening chill began to seep into her bones, and for the first time, the absolute emptiness of her future settled in. She had no money, no home, and a name that meant nothing to anyone. It was then she saw it. Nailed to a weathered municipal board, half covered by a flyer for a lost dog, was a yellowed notice. Property disposal, old mill house, condemned, $10 transfer fee, as is, no occupancy guarantee. To anyone else, it was a legal warning to stay away. To Evelyn, it was a lifeline. The next morning, she walked into the municipal office with the last of her dignity. When she placed her only $10 bill on the counter, the room went quiet. The clerk looked at the bill, then at the frail woman with lavender-scented bags. "You don't want this, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's not just the rot. People don't go near that place unless they have to. It's avoided." "I have to," she replied, her voice small but unbreakable. The path to the mill house was a choked artery of dead grass and collapsed fencing. When the structure finally came into view, it looked less like a house and more like a dying animal slumped beside a dried riverbed. The massive mill wheel, once the heart of the town's wealth, was now half sunken into the mud like a discarded coin. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and a century of shadows. Floorboards groaned under her weight, and the wind whistled through gaps in the stone like a low, mournful flute. But as Evelyn set her 3 bags down in a corner where the roof seemed most stable, a strange sensation washed over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't a guest in Daniel's house. She wasn't an inconvenience to be managed. She was an owner. The survival phase had begun. She didn't have a bed, but she had a floor. She didn't have heat, but she had walls. As she began to clear the broken glass by hand, ignoring the ache in her knees, Evelyn Carter didn't realize she was cleaning the windows to a truth that would soon set the whole town on fire. Survival for Evelyn wasn't a grand cinematic montage. It was a slow, agonizing tally of small victories. Her world was now measured in inches and ounces. Every morning began with the stiffness of her fingers, a cold reminder that her body was as weathered as the cedar shingles above her. She learned the language of the house, which floorboards groaned with warning and which ones held firm. With no electricity, she tracked the sun like an ancient navigator, moving her cleaning efforts from the kitchen to the parlor as the light shifted. She used her lavender-scented clothes to plug the drafts in the window frames. She gathered fallen branches from the dried riverbed, dragging them back with a strength born of pure necessity. When she boiled water over a small, precarious fire in the hearth, the steam felt like a luxury. But the physical toll was immense. More than once, as she knelt to scrub a century of grime, her knees refused to let her stand back up. She would sit there on the damp floor, surrounded by the shadows of a dying mill, wondering if Daniel or his wife even knew she was still breathing. She didn't cry, though. She simply looked at her old family photographs, tucked them back into her bag, and kept going. As the weeks passed, the ruin began to reveal its true shape. Evelyn realized the mill house wasn't just falling apart. It had been altered. While clearing a thick layer of debris near the massive stone fireplace, she noticed something that her decades of domestic life made her sensitive to: inconsistency. The wood grain near the hearth didn't match the rest of the floor. There were scuff marks on the stone that didn't come from furniture, but from heavy, repetitive movement. The air in that corner felt different, not just colder, but hollow. The neighbors in Brackenridge Hollow began to notice the smoke from her chimney. They watched from a distance, seeing the crazy old woman reclaiming a ghost. They didn't know that Evelyn wasn't just cleaning, she was investigating. She had spent a lifetime noticing what people didn't say, and now she was applying that same intuition to the silence of the wood and stone. The turning point came on a Tuesday, during a torrential rainstorm that threatened to bring the entire structure down. As Evelyn moved a heavy, rusted iron grate near the fireplace to catch a leak, her foot struck a board. It didn't thud, it echoed. Her heart, usually slow and weary, began to hammer against her ribs. Using a rusted crowbar she'd found in the shed, she began the slow, painful process of prying. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what she was about to uncover. Underneath the false floor lay a narrow cedar-lined compartment, untouched by the dampness of the house. Inside, wrapped in a heavy oilcloth that smelled of machine oil and old ink, was a bundle of letters and a leather-bound ledger. As she opened the first letter, dated 1924, the name Thomas Whitlock appeared in a sharp, urgent script. To whoever finds this, they are coming for the water rights. They have falsified the signatures. If the wheel stops turning, it isn't because the river ran dry, it's because they choked it. Evelyn realized in that moment that she wasn't alone in this house. She was standing in the middle of a crime scene that had been frozen in time for 100 years. The shame the town felt about this house wasn't about its decay, it was about its guilt. The letters grew more frantic as she read deep into the night by the light of a single candle stub. Thomas Whitlock hadn't just lost his business, he had been systematically erased, much like Evelyn herself. But unlike Evelyn, Thomas had left a map. The final letter contained a sentence that made Evelyn stand up despite the ache in her joints. The iron truth lies buried beneath the heart of the wheel. Look where the shadow falls at noon. Evelyn looked out the broken window toward the massive sunken mill wheel in the yard. It was no longer just a piece of junk. It was a marker. The next morning, the sun didn't just rise. It acted as a spotlight. Following Thomas Whitlock's cryptic instruction, look where the shadow falls at noon. Evelyn stood by the rusted skeletal remains of the mill wheel. Her body ached, a deep, bone-weary throb that reminded her she was 78, not 28. But for the first time in years, she wasn't moving out of habit. She was moving out of purpose. As the clock struck midday, the long shadow of the wheel's central axle pointed like a finger toward a patch of earth choked by gray clay and river stones. Evelyn began to dig. It was a grueling, primitive process. She didn't have a proper shovel, only a heavy garden trowel and her bare hands. Every handful of cold, wet earth felt like a victory over the people who had cast her out. She wasn't just digging for a box. She was digging for her own relevance. Hours bled into each other. Her fingernails were stained black and her breath came in ragged gasps. Just as her strength began to fail, her trowel struck something that didn't sound like stone. It was a dull, metallic clink. Buried 2 feet deep was an iron box, sealed with heavy wax and corroded by a century of damp earth. Bringing it to the surface required every ounce of Evelyn's remaining energy. She dragged it back to the porch of her $10 ruin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When she finally pried the lid open, she didn't find gold or jewels. She found something far more dangerous to the powerful interests of Brackenridge Hollow, the original deeds. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, were property maps, detailed surveys showing that the mill's land boundaries extended far beyond the current town limits, covering areas now occupied by lucrative commercial developments. The Whitlock Ledger, a record of illegal tax seizures and forged signatures used to strip Thomas of his legacy. A final letter, not to a family member, but to a lawyer who never arrived. It detailed a conspiracy of local officials who had traded the town's future for personal gain. Evelyn sat in the silence of her decaying home, realized that the shame of this house wasn't its poverty. The town had ignored this place because it was a monument to a crime, and she, the woman they thought was a discarded burden, was now the only person on earth holding the evidence. The transformation of Evelyn Carter began that evening. She was no longer just a woman trying to survive a drafty house. She was the custodian of a legacy. She took the documents to the only place that could validate them, a small legal aid office in the center of town. When she walked in, still covered in the mud of the riverbank, the young clerk started to offer her a pamphlet for a homeless shelter. Evelyn didn't take it. Instead, she laid the oilcloth-wrapped documents on the desk. "I don't need a bed," she said, her voice steady and echoing with a newfound authority. "I need a lawyer who isn't afraid of the ghosts of Brackenridge Hollow." As the senior attorney was called in and began to flip through the yellowed pages, the atmosphere in the room shifted, the condescension vanished. The invisible woman had suddenly become the most important person in the county. The investigation that followed would ripple through the town like a flood. They found that the land transfers were never legally closed. The corporations paying rent to the city were, in fact, standing on land that, legally speaking, belonged to the owner of the mill house, Evelyn Carter. The legal battle wasn't quick, but for Evelyn, time was now an ally, not an enemy. As the truth came out, the town's perception of her underwent a radical reversal. The neighbors who once twitched their curtains in judgment now brought over baskets of food. The officials who had sold her the house for $10 as a joke were now facing subpoenas. But Evelyn didn't care for their apologies or their sudden kindness. When the settlement was finally reached, a sum that would have made her grandson Daniel's jaw drop, Evelyn did the one thing no one expected. She didn't leave. She didn't buy a mansion in the city or a condo in Florida. She took that money and she rebuilt the mill. The construction crews didn't arrive to tear the mill house down. They arrived to restore it. Under Evelyn's watchful eye, the sagging beams were replaced with sturdy oak, and the drafty walls were insulated with the warmth of 1,000 stories. But Evelyn made a specific, poetic demand. Leave the wheel. The massive iron mill wheel was cleaned of its century of rust, but its scars remained. It was no longer sunken in the mud. It was braced and polished, standing as a silent monument to Thomas Whitlock and the truth that refused to stay buried. Inside the house, the fireplace where Evelyn first heard the hollow echo was preserved, and the original letters were framed behind UV protective glass, a museum of a stolen past, now reclaimed. Word of Evelyn's windfall and her radical transformation of the ruin eventually reached the city. One rainy afternoon, a familiar car pulled up the gravel driveway. It was Daniel. He didn't come with bags. He came with excuses. He spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, and how he had missed her. He looked at the beautiful restored mill house with a greed that he tried to mask as family affection. Evelyn stood on her new porch, the same height she had stood when she was cast out with 3 bags. She didn't shout. She didn't even show anger. She simply looked at the grandson she had once loved and saw a man who only valued what he could count. "I found my home, Daniel," she said, her voice as calm as the river. "But more importantly, I found my value. And you can't afford the rent here." She didn't close the door in his face with a bang. She simply turned and walked back into her light, leaving him in the rain, exactly where he had left her. Evelyn's victory didn't stop at her own front door. She knew that in every dying town like Brackenridge Hollow, there were other invisible people. The elderly, the displaced, the ones the world had labeled as inconvenient. She used the remainder of her settlement to establish the Whitlock Refuge. The old outbuildings of the mill were converted into small, dignified apartments for those with nowhere else to go. It wasn't a charity, it was a community. The town that once avoided the mill house now gravitated toward it. It became a place where history was respected and where no one was ever erased again. As the sun begins to set over the river, now flowing more clearly since the legal restrictions on the water rights were lifted, Evelyn Carter sits on her porch. She still keeps her 3 original bags in her bedroom. They are empty now, but she keeps them as a reminder of the day her life ended, only to truly begin. The sound of the river is a constant rhythmic pulse. It's the sound of a wheel turning. It's the sound of a truth told. People often ask Evelyn how she knew that a $10 pile of rot was worth her last cent. She always gives the same answer. Sometimes the world throws things away because it's afraid of what's inside them. I wasn't looking for a house. I was looking for a witness. And the house was waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The reconstruction of the mill house was more than a renovation, it was a resurrection. Evelyn didn't just fix the roof, she healed the land's reputation. The heavy scent of cedar and fresh white paint replaced the smell of damp rot, and for the first time in a century, the windows of the mill glowed with a warm, inviting amber light at night. Evelyn kept one room exactly as she found it, the small corner where she had first huddled with her 3 bags. She called it the Room of Grace. It served as a reminder that her greatest strength didn't come from the settlement money, but from the moment she had nothing and still chose to move forward. The townspeople of Brackenridge Hollow, once silent witnesses to her struggle, now walked past the mill with a sense of pride. They no longer saw a condemned property, they saw a lighthouse. And the truth that Evelyn uncovered didn't just enrich her, it restored the town's history, forcing it to acknowledge the shadows of the past so it could finally walk into the light. As the first winter arrived, the mill house was no longer a place of shivering drafts, it was a sanctuary. Evelyn watched from her porch as the restored mill wheel turned steadily, its rhythmic splash thud acting as the heartbeat of the valley. She had become a fixture of the community, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a matriarch to be consulted. When young people from the town came to help her with the garden or to hear the story of Thomas Whitlock, she didn't just tell them about the hidden box. She told them about the value of the discarded. Look closely at what the world calls broken, she would say, her eyes bright with a sharp, enduring intelligence. Usually that's just where the most important truths are hiding because nobody thinks to look there. The story of the woman who bought a ruin for $10 became a legend, but for Evelyn, it was simply the moment she finally came home. In the quiet hours of the evening, she often sits by the fireplace, the same one that once hid the secrets of a dead man. She looks at her hands, once stained with the mud of the riverbank, now clean and steady. She realized that Daniel hadn't just thrown her out. He had accidentally set her free. He had pushed her toward the only place where she could truly find herself. The 3 bags she carried on that first day now sit in the hallway, packed not for a departure, but as a symbol of a journey completed. Evelyn Carter is no longer a woman defined by what she lost. She is defined by what she found. Evelyn Carter's journey began with a closed door and ended with a village reclaimed. It stands as a powerful testament to the fact that your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it. Sometimes life has to strip everything away, your home, your comfort, your reputation, just to show you the hidden treasure you've been standing on all along. Evelyn didn't find a fortune, she found a truth that had been waiting 100 years for someone with nothing left to lose to finally dig it up. What is the condemned house in your life? What is the thing people tell you is worthless, but your gut tells you is a goldmine? Maybe it's a dream you've shelved, a talent you've ignored, or a truth you're afraid to speak. Take a lesson from Evelyn. Don't be afraid of the ruins. Sometimes the most broken places are exactly where the healing begins.